Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. Diep was taken to the hospital and found out she has a serious illness. Will James and Diep overcome this together? Stay with me until the end of the video to find out. Late afternoon. The sky hung low and gray, as if warning something ominous was about to happen. The blaring siren of an ambulance shattered the stillness surrounding the hospital. Ly Tu Diep lay curled on the stretcher, her body stiff with pain, eyes glazed from hours of unbearable agony. The pain had come suddenly, relentless, like a wave crashing over her. Doctors rushed in, feet pounding against cold tiled floors, nurses hooking up IVs, checking vitals, running urgent tests. The air was thick with urgency. Diep struggled to breathe, but fought to stay conscious. Her mind was blank, flooded only with the chill from the thin hospital blanket, from the white lights glaring above, from the unfamiliar faces surrounding her. Then the diagnosis came like thunder. A serious illness, one requiring long-term care and strict monitoring. The hospital bed had become her unchosen home. No family stood by. James hadn't arrived. She scanned the room and found only strangers, alone, afraid. Her tears stayed hidden, buried beneath a brave face. Her fingers gripped the sheet tightly, desperate to anchor herself to something real. Amid the fear, a small ember of resolve flickered. She could not break. Not yet. Not now. Closing her eyes, she drew a breath, deep and trembling. This wasn't the end. Not of her body, not of her story. From this moment on, she would fight. Not only against the illness in her blood, but against the quiet terror creeping into her soul. Life doesn't announce its turns, but she understood one truth clearly. She had to survive. On her 5th day in the hospital, the once sterile environment had become all too familiar, almost suffocating. The rhythm of her days repeated. Footsteps of doctors, the clatter of meal trays, the creak of doors opening. It all blurred into a dull, silent cycle. James hadn't arrived yet, caught in urgent work, leaving Diep alone in this foreign place. She lay quietly, watching pale sunlight spill through the window. Around her, other patients welcomed visiting family members, bringing chatter. Warm hugs, bags of fruit, and soft blankets. Diep had none of that. A wave of quiet sadness washed over her, but she didn't let it drown her. Instead, she sat up, peeled fruit carefully, and divided it into small offerings. "Please, have some," she offered gently to each elderly patient nearby. Her voice was soft, respectful. Their eyes lit up, not just from the sweetness of the fruit, but from the kindness behind it. They began to talk. Each person shared their diagnosis, the ups and downs of their treatments, and their gratitude for the dedicated doctors. The air grew lighter, warmer. One elderly woman smiled and said, "This hospital feels like home because we care for each other like family." Diep smiled back, her heart eased, if only a little. That day, she learned that in the midst of solitude, even a small act of kindness could become a lifeline. It wasn't medicine, but it healed something deeper. For the first time in days, she no longer felt invisible. Sometimes the gentlest human gestures are what truly mend the soul. And in that moment, she wasn't just a patient. She was part of something quietly, beautifully human. Morning light filtered softly into the hospital room, casting a golden hue on the quiet scene inside. The silence was gently broken by the hum of conversation, low, comforting, almost melodic. Diep sat among the elderly patients, her hands delicately peeling fruit while her ears soaked in their stories. One woman smiled. The doctor said I'll be discharged on the 4th. I'm almost 90% recovered. Another added, I had severe tonsillitis, but the medicine here really helped. Soft laughter followed, light as a breeze, but strong enough to break through lingering fears. It's funny, someone said. We came to the hospital but found joy here too. We share food, talk like old friends. Diep remained quiet, but her eyes sparkled. These strangers had unknowingly become her anchors, not by blood, but by the simplicity of shared humanity. Then a voice grew serious. I used to think money was everything, one patient said. But now I know health is number one. Without it, all the money in the world means nothing. Diep nodded, recalling a line she once read. If you have $1 million, but lose the number one, your health, then all you're left with are zeros. The room fell into reflective silence. From shared pain, these people had built something quietly powerful, connection. Here, in a place associated with illness and waiting, bloomed the rarest of things, warmth. Diep realized that hospitals didn't only treat the body, they healed the soul. And in that simple, unadorned morning, she felt something rare returning to her, a quiet sense of hope. James arrived at the hospital on a quiet afternoon, just as the sun peeked through scattered clouds. His gaze scanned each bed before stopping at Diep, who sat silently by the window, cradling her bruised arm, an arm marked by too many IV lines. He approached without a word, no dramatic entrance, just a look that said everything. She wasn't alone anymore. Does it still hurt today? He asked softly. Just a little, she replied, forcing a smile. Her voice wavered. It's all bruised now. James gently took her hand, turned her wrist, eyes filled with silent ache. He said nothing, but in his touch was 1,000 unspoken things. No grand gestures, just presence. And in that moment, it was more than enough. Moments later, James met briefly with Chien, his colleague, downstairs. They discussed a lumber contract, new clauses, quality checks, and his ongoing support for a charity project. The world outside kept spinning, deadlines looming, yet his every path circled back here. When he returned, he held a carton of strawberry milk in his hand. I found the exact one you like, he smiled. Diep chuckled softly and took it. She sipped quietly, her throat tight. In that simple gesture, James had said everything, without needing to say anything. Amid all the things demanding his attention, he made sure she remained his priority. No declarations of love, no roses, no rings. Just a man showing up when she needed him most. And sometimes that is the loudest way to love someone. Is there a church nearby? Diep asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked at her, surprised at first, then nodded gently. There is. I'll take you. That afternoon, beneath a pale sky and damp ground still wet from the morning rain, James helped her walk slowly to a small church hidden behind a line of old trees. Inside, the sanctuary was silent, lit by the soft glow of candlelight. The warm flickers danced on cracked stone walls, illuminating the quiet weight of time. Diep sat, fingers interlocked. James stood beside her, bowed his head. Thank you, Lord, for our health each day, for your love that stays with us. Please cover Diep in strength and mercy. His words were not rehearsed, not formal, but raw, like a dam breaking inside a heart that had held too much. Diep closed her eyes, saying nothing aloud. Still, her heart spoke silently, If I get better, I'll live differently. I'll cherish life. James turned to her, voice soft. You don't have to speak. Just pray from your heart. They sat in stillness. The only sounds were the breeze slipping through the church rafters and the faint echo of a distant bell. No incense, no grand ceremony. Just two people leaning on a fragile faith in the middle of a life uncertain. It wasn't about religion. It was about surrender. A plea from souls worn thin, asking not for miracles but for peace. In that quiet space, among old wood and candlelight, something tender passed between them. And in that silence they knew they needed each other now more than ever. Evening fell slowly, casting long shadows across the sterile white walls. The hospital room was hushed, the steady beeping of a monitor the only sound anchoring the space. Diep had just finished her IV when the door opened quietly. James stepped in. There was something different in his eyes. He wasn't carrying milk or papers or small talk. This time, he carried something heavier. Without a word, he knelt beside her bed and reached into his pocket, revealing a small velvet box. I know I've waited too long, he began, his voice low, fragile. But I also know that if I don't ask now, I might regret it forever. We've been through enough to know what matters. Diep's eyes widened, heart thudding. Around them, the other patients watched in hushed delight. Say yes, someone whispered, chuckling. But Diep didn't reach for the ring. Instead, her shoulders trembled slightly. I'm not ready, she said, her voice soft but firm. I've been sick, I've failed before. I'm scared I'll be a burden to you. She paused, then added, I want to marry you someday, but not like this, not when I feel like I'm only half of who I used to be. James looked up at her, no frustration in his eyes, only calm. I understand, he said simply, no pleading, no pressure, just love, steady and quiet. He took her hand and she let him. Tears fell from her cheeks, and he wiped them gently. In that moment, she realized that love didn't need a yes or a ceremony. It needed patience, presence, and James, kneeling there without anger or disappointment, gave her all three. After the unanswered proposal, the air between them grew even quieter. Diep leaned back against the hospital bed, her gaze fixed on the fading light outside. James sat beside her, saying nothing. She slipped the ring off her finger, gently placing it into his hand. I really love it, but right now I don't feel worthy of it. James didn't take it back. He smiled softly. Keep it, wear it when you're ready. Diep turned away, tears rolling down her cheeks. I'm just scared, she whispered. What if the illness returns? What if you become the man with the sick wife? Someone who couldn't keep going. James pulled her into his arms, his voice low and steady. Don't think like that. No matter how weak you feel, I'll still be here. His phone rang. It was his mother, gently reminding him to take care of Diep and promising to watch over her farm while she recovered. Diep listened quietly, then said, I feel like I owe you and your mother. James shook his head. It's not a debt, it's love. Night settled fully outside, the sky dimming to shades of gray. Diep rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing calm. No more words were needed. In a world full of uncertainties, they held on to something simple, each other. There were no vows, no wedding, no closure. But in the stillness of that evening, love lived in the silence, in the presence, in the way he stayed. It wasn't the ending of a story. It was a quiet promise. to wait, to heal, and to begin again when the heart was whole.
Ok, Lý Tu Diep nhập viện cấp cứu, được chẩn đoán mắc căn bệnh nguy hiểm, cần điều trị lâu dài. Trong những ngày nằm viện cô đơn, không người thân bên cạnh, ngoài James, Diệp đã tìm thấy sự ấm áp từ bên bệnh nhân cùng phòng, học cách trân trọng sức khỏe. James vừa được gánh vác công việc, vừa được chăm sóc cô tận tình, thậm chí đưa cô đến nhà thờ để cầu nguyện. Cao trào câu chuyện khi James quỳ gối cầu hôn Diệp ngay tại bệnh viện. Cô xúc động nhưng phải từ chối vì chưa sẵn sàng. Cuối cùng cả hai ôm nhau trong nước mắt. Không có cái kết hoàn hảo, nhưng là một lời hứa sẽ đợi nhau, sẽ cùng nhau chữa lành để bắt đầu lại khi mọi thứ đã đầy đủ.